Let's break away from the legend for a moment. When most people picture Doc Holliday's death, they think of a cinematic ending, one final cough, a quiet fade-out, and then the camera pans respectfully over a grave. But here's the real question, rarely asked and almost never shown. After Doc Holliday breathed his last, what actually happened to his body? Not the mythic version, not the gravestone, but the awkward, unsolved reality of his physical remains, how they were handled, moved, and ultimately disposed of. The story of Doc's post-mortem isn't a legend. It's a physical aftermath, and it's far stranger, grimmer, and more uncomfortable than anything Hollywood has ever put on screen. Hollywood likes to show the end of an outlaw's story as something noble, or at least neat. Doc, pale but dignified, lying in a tidy bed, friends gathered round, the undertaker ready to give him a hero's burial. But the facts of death don't care about legend. They don't pause for respectful fade-outs. Off-screen, bodies are heavy, awkward, and messy. The real aftermath is about dirt, fluids, and the practical business of getting a decaying corpse into the ground. There are no swelling orchestras, no admirers crowding the street, and no miraculous preservation of dignity. For all the stories of Doc's larger-than-life reputation, his literal end was defined by biology, not by narrative. Doc Holliday died in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, in 1887. He was in his mid-30s, ravaged by tuberculosis after years of decline. His body had been failing for months, wasting away, coughing blood, exhausted and isolated. In the end, there was no grand confrontation or final shootout. He died in his hotel room, alone in a mountain town, best known for its mineral springs and its distance from the gunfights of his past. By the time he died, Doc was physically broken, a far cry from the gambling, gun-slinging legend so often depicted in films. And here is where the real suspense begins. Once Doc was gone, who took care of his body? Was it handled with any care? Or was it treated like a problem to be solved as quickly as possible? Was there a respectful washing and dressing, or a hurried, impersonal job done by people eager to avoid a disease-ridden corpse? The question isn't just about burial rites. It's about physical reality, how this notorious outlaw's body was managed in those awkward, taboo hours between death and the final shovel of dirt. Here, the story splits from legend and turns toward the all-too-human question of dignity versus necessity. Here's what is actually documented, stripped of legend and guesswork. Doc Holliday died of tuberculosis on the 8th of November, 1887, in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. His death certificate and local records agree on this point. He was a 36-year-old dentist turned gambler, brought down not by bullets, but by disease. There's no dispute about the next step either. His body was buried at Linwood Cemetery, up on a steep, rocky hill overlooking the town. These are the only hard contemporary facts. The date, the place, the illness that killed him, and the location of his grave. But when it comes to the next questions, what happened to his body in those hours between death and burial? There's a deep silence in the record. No obituary, undertaker's account, or witness statement tells us who cleaned the corpse, if anyone bothered with a proper washing, or whether Doc was dressed in traveling clothes, a burial shroud, or whatever was at hand. There's no preserved record of a funeral or a service, either public or private. We don't know who, if anyone, stood at the grave or spoke over the coffin. The documents simply do not say. For the step-by-step story of Doc's final handling, we have only the silence of missing pages. So here's where the story stands. We know Doc Holliday died of tuberculosis in Glenwood Springs and was buried at Linwood Cemetery. That's the solid ground. But every other detail, the washing, the dressing, who dared to touch him, whether there was a prayer or even a moment of hesitation, just isn't preserved in the surviving record. The gap is striking, especially for someone so famous. What fills that gap is not invention, but careful reconstruction. What likely happened, based on period practices, medical realities, and what we know about death and disease in frontier Colorado. And that period reality is not gentle. Tuberculosis was the most feared infectious disease of the age. A corpse dead of TB was a hazard, believed to spread sickness through its breath, its blood, even its sweat. Undertakers, when they could be found, were notoriously reluctant to handle the bodies of consumptives. In many towns, handling a TB corpse was a job few wanted, even for pay. It was common for bodies to be buried quickly, sometimes within hours of death, to limit the risk of contagion and the smell of decay. While we cannot say with certainty that Doc Holliday's corpse met every one of these indignities, the odds are strong, based on what happened to countless others who died of TB in that era, that his body was handled with speed and a certain amount of fear. If there was a washing or dressing, it was likely minimal, done by someone rushing through the job, eager to finish, maybe even holding a handkerchief over their mouth. Dignity, if it existed, was almost accidental. Medically speaking, corpses of people who died from advanced tuberculosis were usually in a grim state. While no one documented Doc Holliday's body in detail, it's medically plausible to say he would have been painfully thin, his skin stretched tight over bone, marked by the sunken cheeks and hollowed eyes of a long illness. TB often left bodies stained with old blood from coughing fits, and decomposition set in quickly, sometimes leaving a foul and overwhelming odor. The clothes and sheets around the body could have been soiled, and the risk of fluids leaking out, either blood or other bodily fluids, was high. The effect, for anyone who had to handle the body, would have been both disturbing and physically unpleasant, a reality that's hard to reconcile with any legend of a glamorous or heroic death. Given the attitudes and fears of the time, it's highly likely that Doc's body was prepared with the absolute minimum of care. Undertakers in frontier towns, especially when faced with a TB corpse, rarely engaged in elaborate washing or dressing. Instead, the washing would have been cursory at best, probably just enough to remove the worst visible stains. The body may have been left in the nightshirt or worn clothes from his sickbed, or perhaps draped in a simple shroud, but there is no evidence of a full change into formal attire. Embalming was rare in remote Colorado then, and the urgency to dispose of the body quickly was real. The coffin, if provided, was likely a plain, inexpensive box. The people handling the body, whether undertakers or others pressed into the job, would have worked quickly, perhaps even reluctantly, conscious of the smell and the fear of infection hovering over the room. The whole process, from deathbed to casket, was more about risk avoidance and social obligation than any notion of reverence or ritual. And in the hours after death, it's not just the undertakers who kept their distance. There are no records of a major funeral procession, no accounts of townspeople lining up to pay their respects, and no outpouring of public grief. In Glenwood Springs in 1887, tuberculosis was so feared that most people avoided even seeing a TB victim, and that avoidance didn't end with death. Holliday's body was taken to the cemetery with only the barest attendants, perhaps a clergyman, an undertaker, and a handful of acquaintances or staff from the hotel. For the wider public, the main reaction was probably relief that the risk of contagion had been removed from their midst, rather than mourning for a notorious gambler and gunman. What we do know directly is this: Doc Holliday was buried at Linwood Cemetery on a hillside just above the town of Glenwood Springs. The grave itself was simple and isolated, surrounded by rocky soil and sparse trees, a far cry from the carefully tended heroes' burial grounds of legend. There was no marble marker, no elaborate memorial, just a patch of dirt in a lonely mountain cemetery where the body of John Henry Holliday was left to rest. For all the controversy and fascination that surrounded his life, the physical end was as unceremonious and anonymous as frontier death could be. If you picture Doc Holliday's final resting place as a crowded affair, a line of mourners, a marble headstone, a preacher blessing the Western legend, those images do not match the evidence or the silence in the record. There is no documentation of a crowd gathered at his grave, nor any reports of a solemn memorial or a town-wide farewell. In fact, the first accounts suggest his grave was as bare as his reputation was notorious, no formal marker, no flowers, and almost certainly no grand send-off. What little can be said is that the site was unadorned, a patch of earth on a cold hillside, offering no hint that one of the West's most infamous names was buried there at all. It is important to say this lack of ceremony is not definitive proof that no one cared, but the absence of evidence for a public outpouring or organized tribute speaks volumes about the town's relationship with Holliday at the end. So when we try to resolve the aftermath, the most likely scenario is far from heroic. Doc Holliday's body almost certainly received only the minimum required handling, a basic washing and dressing, a quick enclosure in a modest coffin, and a short, practical trip up the hill to Linwood Cemetery. There was no drawn-out procession, no speeches, no mythic rites. The physical reality was swift and utilitarian. The goal was to get the body underground quickly, with as little risk or fuss as possible. Whatever later legends painted over this moment, Holliday's actual send-off was not that of a folk hero, but of a man whose body posed more of a health concern than a symbol for commemoration. The legend, as we know it, was built up only years later, as stories grew and headstones appeared, not at the grave itself, but in the telling. In the end, even if there had been anyone who wanted to honor him, the mix of fear, pragmatism, and social reputation meant that any greater ceremony was quickly overruled. The risk of TB, the rush of everyday life, and a certain public eagerness to move on left Doc Holliday's remains in near anonymity. For a time, his grave was just another patch of mountain dirt. The dignity he could not claim in life eluded him in death, at least until the legend makers returned to Glenwood Springs, and the story of Doc Holliday began to grow larger than the lonely plot where his body actually lay. The reality, then, is simple and physical. The Old West did not spare even its most notorious or fascinating outlaws from the basic humiliations of death. There was no final triumph, no cinematic closure, just a body at risk of disease, handled briskly, buried plainly, and left to the elements. What has survived is the legend, not the stench, not the anxious undertaker, not the dirt on his grave. It is easy to remember the mythic gambler and gunfighter, but almost impossible to look away from the hard truth. When it came to the body, even the famous Doc Holliday met the same unsentimental end as countless others, as real and unglamorous as death gets.